In today's video, we are making the last block of Behind the Block Series 1, and it is the Pennsylvania block. Hi, I'm Tom and I am the Colourblind Quilter, and you are watching Behind the Block Season 1. So we have made it to block 12 of our series. I cannot believe how quickly this has whizzed by. Throughout the course of this series, we have been making blocks from squares and rectangles, building our skills as quilters, and we are working towards making our sampler quilt. So far, you've made log cabins, bento boxes, woven blocks, 9 patches, disappearing 9 patches, disappearing 4 patches, so many blocks, but this is the last one. And I'm so excited. As always, a free worksheet in the description below that's going to give you everything you need to cut and how to sew this step by step, as well as a colouring page and instructions on how to make this in 3 different sizes. There's also the worksheet that has all the fabric requirements and cutting instructions to make the entire sampler quilt. And then there is the colouring page on Prequilt where you can play with fabrics and colours to make the sampler quilt your own. So this is a 9 patch, but within that 9 patch you'll find a 4 patch and then plain squares. There are lots of things that you can do with this and play with this, and we're going to look at a few of those later in this video. But if you've missed any of the videos in this series, you'll find a link in the corner to the playlist that has everything there so that you can get sewing and catching up with us. And don't forget to stick around to the end of the video so you can see those example quilts that I was talking about. So let's get started then. So to make this block, you are going to need, in fabric A, you will need one 4.5 inch square and one 2.5 inch by 20.5 inch strip. And in the background, which is white, you will need 4 4.5 inch squares and one 2.5 inch by 20.5 inch strip. I like to lay everything out on my mat before I get started, and then with the leader at the sewing machine, we are going to place our fabric A and background 2.5 inch by 20.5 inch strips right sides together. You can pin these if you like, and then we are joining with a careful 1/4 inch seam. And then we are going to take these to the pressing mat, and with the red on top, we are going to set that seam, and then we are going to gently roll this back and we are going to finger press it, being very careful not to stretch or distort this strip. We want to keep it as straight as possible. So use your fingers and your iron to get it nice and straight, nice and flat, get the seam fully open. Take your time with this. And then get a ruler and just check that that seam lies nice and straight. And if you're happy with that, then we'll proceed to cutting. So lining it up on the mat, with the lines, we are going to just tidy the edge up by cutting a tiny little slither of fabric off. And then once we are happy with that, we are going to cut 8 2.5 inch segments from this block. Now use the lines on your ruler to line up with the seam, the top and bottom and left edges of the strip every time you make a cut. My ruler is 2.5 inches wide, so it does actually make this a lot easier and faster. But you can do this with any ruler. And once you've cut these 8 pieces, you'll see that you're left with just a tiny little bit of fabric. And then we are going to arrange these into the 4 patch. We need to make 4 patches, so just pile them up, and then we're going to take them back to the sewing machine. And we want to make sure that our seams nest, so make sure that those seams are butted up against each other, and then sew on through. You can pin these, of course, to make sure that the seams don't move and that the edges are nice and equal, but I prefer to just adjust as I go. I do use a leader every time I sew to catch any thread tension issues on my sewing machine. You may or may not need this depending on your sewing machine, but repeat that for all the 4 blocks and then snip them apart, and we are heading back to the pressing board. And on the pressing mat, we are going to press that seam towards the right of the 4 patch. So just set the seam, roll it back, finger press to get it nice and flat, and then run your iron over it, being very careful not to distort or stretch. And there we have our 4 patches. Now, arranging these on your cutting board with the white and red square, just lay them out. Make sure that the 4 patches are going in the right direction. And then we're going to take the 4 patch and the white background squares, and we're going to place them right sides together, and we're going to join those at the sewing machine with a careful 1/4 inch seam. Please do make sure that you get the 4 patches in the right orientation so you don't have to unpick a seam, and chain piece these through. And then we're going to press these towards the 4 patch. So with the 4 patch on top, set your seam, press and then roll back, and then press again, making sure the seam is nice and flat. Use your fingers as necessary, but be careful not to swirl. Place these right back onto the table with the rest of the blocks, and you can see here that I'm struggling to get this in the right direction because my brain is not working. Take the middle row and place those right sides together and join again with a careful 1/4 inch seam with the red square on top. Press towards the red square. Now we take each of the final pieces of each row and we place them right sides together. Oops, wrong way around. And then we take these to the sewing machine and we just chain piece them through. So feel free to pin these. There are no seams to match on this, so it should be fairly easy. I'm just adjusting as I go. And then on the top and bottom row, we want to press towards the 4 patch. So set the seam and then finger press and then set it with your iron. In the middle row, we are pressing towards the red square again. Take your time here, be very careful not to stretch anything. And then we're putting these back on the mat and you can see the direction that the seams are going. Now, top and middle row, place these right sides together, make sure those seams are nested nicely. Put a pin in if required, and then join with a careful 1/4 inch seam, making sure that the seams don't get pushed in the wrong direction when you're sewing these together. And then we are going to press towards the top of the block. You may find this is a little bulky, but that's okay. Just use your fingers, smooth it out, get it nice and flat, and then use your iron to then press that nice and flat. And then we take the 3rd row and place it right sides together. Again, getting those seams nesting. Being careful to make sure that it doesn't push the seams in the wrong direction as you sew. Pin is required. And then again, we are pressing that seam towards the bottom of the block. Again, you may find a little bit of bulk here, but that's okay. Use your fingers, flatten it out, get it nice and flat, and then use the iron to press it nice and flat. And just take your time, make sure the block is really well pressed and flat. You can flip it over, set the seams from the other side as well, get it all sitting really nice and crisp. And that was the Pennsylvania block. So that was Pennsylvania, and that was the last block in our series, and it's dead easy to make because we've built blocks using all of the techniques that were required before in this series. There are ways to chain piece this as always. For those 4 patches, instead of just cutting segments that are long enough to make 4 patches, I would cut with the fabric strips, join those together, cut them into segments and make lots of 4 patches. And then when it comes to assembly line sewing, I would take a pile of 4 patches and a pile of those white squares, and I would just sit and chain piece them all together. And then I would take a pile of the white squares and a pile of the red squares and I would chain piece them all together. Now, if you wanted to be really clever, you could actually strip piece the center row of this block by taking 2 white width of fabric strips and a red width of fabric strip, joining those 3 strips together, pressing the seams to the red strip, and then cut them into segments and then join those to the 4 patch rows. And that would be a quick way to make this if you wanted to make lots of these. Now, I alluded to playing with this block. There are other things that you can do with this apart from what I've done here. As you can see, I have kept this in 2 colors, just red and white with the red center. You could very easily replace the red center with another 4 patch. That would look great. You could replace it with another color altogether. That would be great as well. You could also have the top left and bottom right corners in 1 color, and you could have the top right and bottom left 4 patches in a 2nd color and a 4 patch in the middle. Lots of variations that you could play with. So let's take a look at some of the example quilts and the variations that we can make with this. So this is example 1, and this is made with the block just exactly as it is, no alterations or changes to it, laying it out in rows and columns. And you can see how it creates this very nice effect, very similar to an Irish chain. I do think this is very nice, and I can see secondary patterns in there. Now, if you add a thin white border to the outside, you'll get the effect where the red seems to float, and that really helps to make this pattern pop. I do like this, and as I say, as you move your eyes over it, you see many different secondary patterns and effects popping out. So that's the base, that's what we can do with just the block as it is. Now, if we keep that block just as it is, but this time we add a thin red border around the outside, you can see that it creates a slightly different look here, and it connects all the red sections on the outside of the block up. I quite like this, and I can't explain why, but I just like the way that the red frames this. Again, I can still see the secondary pattern in the white and the secondary patterns in the red, and it still looks like the Irish chain, but there's just something about the red border on the outside that just changes how this looks, even though it is actually still exactly the same. In our 3rd example, all that we've done here is we have changed the center of the block to use a blue square, and everything else is the same, but now you can see that it's starting to create a slightly different secondary pattern. And when you look at this with slightly soft focus eyes, you start to see diamond patterns made with the blue, and then where the corners of the blocks come together, which is the 4 patches, it starts to create this other effect of diamonds in that shape as well. And it's pretty cool. It's a bit of an illusion on the eyes the way that this works out, but I really like this, and it just adds a little bit more interest to the block, and it's dead easy to do in the construction because you just swap the center red square for a blue one. Now we're starting to get interesting. So before this, I mentioned that you can change the center square to a 4 patch. And so this is the result of changing that center square to a 4 patch. And this really starts to make the single iris chain pop in this design. You can see that there are diamonds forming now. There are center motifs inside those diamonds. It's very, very nice. I really was quite surprised when I saw this and saw how quickly it had changed just from changing the center square. Again, so where the blocks come together in the corners, those 4 patches are joining to make it look like there is another square there. So this is very cool and very interesting, and I think this would look nice with a really curvy quilting design over the top of it. Again, though, I've just kept the thin red border because it just frames this very nicely, and I just do really appreciate how this looks. And then finally, in the 5th design, we have just changed the top left and the bottom right corner 4 patches. And all I've done is I have swapped them for blue 4 patches. So the top right and bottom left are still the red 4 patches, but the top left and bottom right are now blue 4 patches. And then these are rotated to create this look. And it's very striking now with that blue motif in the middle of the red diamonds. And I really, really do like this very much. And I think it starts to remind me a little bit about Space Invaders, that central motif. It's got a very kind of bitmappy, pixelated feel to this, but I do love how this looked. And looking at this, I think that a diagonal crosshatch quilting design would look amazing on this. You might also try this with the blue border on the outside and see how that changes the feel, but I just like how everything connects up, and I think this is really nice. And again, now looking for an excuse to make one of these quilts. And so that was how to make the Pennsylvania blocks and some example quilts. Don't forget there are free worksheets in the description below, the step-by-step instructions for this block, and then the cutting and fabric requirements for making the entire sampler quilt. I really hope you have been sewing along. I can't wait to see all the beautiful blocks and quilts that you have been making. Please do continue to share them on Instagram using the hashtag BTBSeason1 and tag me, the Colourblind Quilter, so that I can follow along with your progress. In the last video of this series, I am going to be showing you how to finish constructing your quilt top. And that includes attaching sashing between the blocks and then borders around the outside so that we can complete this. And then we're going to also talk about a few ideas for how you could potentially quilt this and finish it off. I have had a great time making all these blocks, and I really hope that you have learned some new skills and had an opportunity to practice them while making all these lovely blocks. If you found this video useful, please do consider giving it a thumbs up, and make sure you're subscribed and click the bell so you'll get notified when that final video in this series comes out, as well as some of the other great content I have coming up in 2022. So take care, and I will see you next time.